We're going to move on to something different and move on to a legend, really. One of the finest and most influential guitarists of all time in the UK, and songwriter as well. His name is Jimmy Page. He began as a session musician, was very much in demand. He then went on to form and lead Led Zeppelin, who became one of the world's biggest bands in the 1970s. And he's been back through all the original tapes of Led Zeppelin recordings to begin a remastering process. First, we get the first 3 Led Zeppelin albums, and it's the beginning of a campaign that will see all 9 of the group's albums reissued with era-appropriate bonus tracks. When he came by our studios recently, we had the opportunity to talk about the reissues, play some of those tracks which have never previously been released or heard. And we began, though, with talking about the 60s, which ended for Jimmy with a massive American tour off the back of Led Zeppelin II. So before work began on the follow-up, some time off was booked in. And I began our conversation by asking him if he managed to relax at all in 1970.
Yeah. I tell you what, if you looked at Led Zeppelin's schedule of what we were doing each side of this so-called time off, it wasn't very long. The other guys had families too, you know, they had children, and my goodness, we'd worked so hard during 1969, just looking at the itinerary of the year. It would make one tired to look at it. And you know what? That wasn't even the full picture. There was so much extra that was done. So we really, really deserved a bit of a break in every respect. And we'd sort of cracked America in, I'd say, sort of one tour. The first tour that we went over there, with everything it just spread like wildfire across the States. But then it was a question of just going around, and, you know, there were so many people coming to see us right across the whole continent of the States. We'd recorded on the road over there in the States. We'd come back and done a bit more Thank You and Living Loving Maid over here, and then gone back and recorded, and it was mixed. And now the point is, the album's out, we've done touring around it, and we've got a break.
Tell us a bit about that cottage in Wales.
Yeah, I want to get to that. Robert had said, there's this cottage I used to go to, I believe when he was younger. His parents had gone there in Wales, and do you fancy coming down there? He was going to take his family, his wife and his daughter, and I had a sort of current lady at the time, and I said, yeah, you know, that sounds a good idea. He took his acoustic guitar, and I took my acoustic guitar, because that's exactly what I would be doing if I came back off of a tour or whatever, or all the way through. I'd be playing on the guitar, and it wouldn't be long before I'd be coming up with something, you know. So, yeah, it made sense to take the guitars down there. It wasn't an unnatural thing to be having songs that were more featured around the acoustic, because I mean, I'd always been writing on the acoustic, if you see what I mean. Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You, all that sort of stuff. Ramble On, it's there. You know, it's got the strong character within album 1, album 2. And so here we are at the 3rd album, and I'd always wanted to do Gallows Pole. You see, the whole thing of Led Zeppelin is that you've got 4 members of the band, and their contribution is just so strong, and their character playing, and that's what the Led Zeppelin vehicle was for everybody. I'd never played guitar before like I played on that first album. John Bonham never had the opportunity to play like that on anything, and so on and so forth. But the essence of it is how these sort of master musicians came together and played as a band. That was unparalleled. And yeah, the version of Gallows Pole is really great. You know, it's a stripped down version, doesn't have any mandolin, doesn't have any banjo, no electric guitars. This is it. This is where it's starting from. It's going to get layered along the way to come through to the version that we all know finally.
Led Zeppelin and the alternate mix of Gallows Pole, and you can really hear the individual contributions from Jimmy Page on guitar, John Paul Jones doing some great bass lines on that, fabulous drumming from John Bonham, and Robert Plant, of course, on vocals. I'm talking with Jimmy Page about the remastering of Led Zeppelin III, and I asked him, with this album, was one of the ambitions for it to prove that Led Zeppelin had a great dynamic range?
I think that because we had this sort of break, what the recordings were going to be, it was quite clear from the history of the first album and the second album. We're in our early days here by approaching the third, but it's a summing up of where we are at that point of time. Certainly within the whole writing and performance process, because the first album and the second album are really quite radically different if you just take them on and listen to them, but actually the common threads are in there that are consistent all the way through. It had been a reflective time, even albeit pretty short, but it gave us the opportunity to continue with the policy of summing up where you were at that point of time.
And on the song Friends, one of the few Led Zeppelin tracks where you hear some strings.
I had the whole structure of Friends before we went into any sort of minor rehearsal, and the rehearsal was done because the first two albums were sort of rehearsed at my house, so I suppose, well, go and rehearse up my way. So, because John Bonham lived in the same area, so I went up there with Immigrant Song and Friends, and I worked through it with Robert and John Bonham because John Paul Jones wasn't there. So, but I had the whole structure of it, and how I'd thought about that was the movements of it. I was thinking along the lines of what you would hear with Indian music, the string parts, or indeed Arabic, where you've got this whole movement following the line. In fact, it's not even following the line there. That's what's established. But I'm thinking of that when I've done the structure of the song. But I said, I want to have strings on this, following this part. In fact, I'd like to have had a huge, really deep string section with it as well.
Did the others instantly agree with that, or is there some opposition to the idea?
No. No one disagree with it, because it wasn't too beyond the realms of imagination that it was the right way to go. But John, I said, follow these lines, and that's what you had to do. There was nothing, you want anything else. It just needed to follow the lines of what the guitar's doing. So he went away and scored it, and we just had a quick session with some string players to put that on.
And then Celebration Day, classic Led Zeppelin track. What do you recall about that?
It's got a very interesting groove to it, Celebration Day. And again, when it comes down to groove, you've got to say, it's John Bonham and this wonderful approach. The guitar solo that's on the final thing. I used to put the guitar solos on at the end of the, once everything else had gone on, like the final vocals and all of that. And I'd usually put little textures of guitar, so that when Robert did his final vocals, it was pretty complete underneath. But the guitar solo, it is really quite joyous and cheeky, and it is so in character to Celebration Day. That's how I'd sort of arrive at doing the guitar solos, but it was almost like a filigree piece that was, inserted or whatever, just to put the cherry on the cake.
Led Zeppelin and Immigrant Song, and talking to Jimmy Page, who spent countless hours going through this labour of love, really.
Over the whole of the catalogue, yeah.
Yeah. Why? What was your impetus to doing that and to remastering it?
Well, Johnny, it was like this. Really, with a sort of analysis of how the music was being heard in this current day and age, it made serious sense to go back to the analogue tapes. 20 years ago, we were remastered for the newly blossoming, well, it wasn't quite blossoming, it was already established CD market, but it was for that whole aspect of CDs. Well, the whole area whereby people are listening to digital music has it's changed. I mean, it feels like you almost need to reassess every 10 years to see how things are being listened to and see whether you need to make adjustments. So I wanted to make sure that we had the vinyl, that we had best that we could do on the CDs, going back to the original analog, of course. But, the good thing about all of this is that we're here and we're talking about the releases of the first three, and you've got all the rest to come, and there's real surprises right across the whole of it.
Is it a reflection at all on the music being produced today that there's so much interest in Led Zeppelin way back in the 70s?
I think with Led Zeppelin, it's music that, okay, you can hear it. If you listen to it, you're more than likely going to get it. You're going to get what it's about, and these fantastic musicians that are at the top of their game, they come together and they play as a band, which is just sort of exploding with talent and performance. an attitude, not only that, with an attitude of pioneering within the whole sort of musical landscape, so that what happens is the fact that we start making songs as certain sort of milestones along the way that are really influential. Oh, it's really cool to have been in a band that has done that, but not only that, has spanned all these years. Across those years, there's new listeners coming in all the time.
Going back to 1970 when the album came out, I mean, 69 was massive. Whole Lot of Love was massive. There was such huge anticipation for Led Zeppelin III.
Yeah.
I mean, there were record pre-orders of 1 million in America alone. And yet, when it came out, some of the critics were a bit negative about it.
Yes, I know.
Did you find that very hard at the time?
Well, the problem that reviewers had across the Led Zeppelin catalogue was the fact that because Led Zeppelin wouldn't put out singles, I didn't want to be anchored to a whole singles market, because in those days, when you had an album, you had the second album, you had to have a serious point of reference to a single, albeit hopefully that it was a hit, but from the first album. So that just wasn't going to be the policy. So, because all of a sudden you're worrying about the single, and what's going to be the single, I just had no time for that. I just had more time for making music that had the freedom to be able to create stuff without having to worry about blasted singles and all of that. But you get people reviewing the albums with maybe half a dozen albums to review that night, and they just wouldn't know where to start. So by the time it got to the third album, they go, well, there's no whole lot of love on this. You know, they seem to be quite upset, as opposed to listening to well, we got Immigrant Song, that's pretty happening, isn't it? Why didn't you listen to that properly and understand what the lyrics are about? And how come Since I've Been Loving You hasn't sort of touched some sort of nerve or emotion in you? Well, okay, it doesn't matter, because what's happening is that in those days we just had to make albums and play live. There wasn't a whole lot of press or whatever to do relative to that. And all I knew, and what was clear to the band and everybody else who was honest about it, was that we just kept getting more and more and more people trying to attend the gigs, because sometimes, they couldn't get in or whatever, but we would be selling out, doing multiple gigs in cities, even by 1970. And that just didn't stop with Led Zeppelin. We couldn't supply the demand of people that wanted to come and see us.
Were you happy with your guitar solo on Since I've Been Loving You? Because Terry Manning, one of the engineers, reckons it was the greatest guitar solo of all time.
The guitar solo was done in Island Studios, and I went down and there was some amps outside, and I thought, oh, let's try this amp out. And even though it wasn't my amp and I shouldn't really have done it, I connected it up to my speaker cabinet, plugged in the guitar, and it was singing like a beauty. That's it. It was just, just one or two takes. Well, no, it was more than one take probably. The solos, I didn't work them out beforehand, note for note. It was just take a deep breath and put the red light on. My goodness, we'd worked so hard during 1969. Just looking at the itinerary of the year, it would make one tired to look at it. And you know what? That wasn't even the full picture. There was so much extra that was done. So we really, really deserved a bit of a break in every respect.
We're going to move on to something different and move on to a legend, really. One of the finest and most influential guitarists of all time in the UK, and songwriter as well. His name is Jimmy Page. He began as a session musician, was very much in demand. He then went on to form and lead Led Zeppelin, who became one of the world's biggest bands. And I began our conversation by asking him if he managed to relax at all in 1970.
Yeah. I tell you what, if you looked at Led Zeppelin's schedule of what we were doing each side of this so-called time off, it wasn't very long. The other guys had families too, they had children. And
studios recently, we had the opportunity to talk about the reissues, play some of those tracks which have never previously been released or heard. And we began though with talking about the 60s, which ended for Jimmy with a massive American tour off the back of Led Zeppelin II. So before work began on the follow-up, some time off was booked in the 1970s. And he's been back through all the original tapes of Led Zeppelin recordings to begin a remastering process. First, we get the first 3 Led Zeppelin albums, and it's the beginning of a campaign that will see all 9 of the group's albums reissued with era-appropriate bonus tracks. When he came by